and quite a fulsome presentation this morning. I want to, of course, welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson Center on behalf of Lee Hamilton and the Africa program here. I think you all know the center well, so we won't go into our normal spiel on that. I want to thank Dick McCall before I begin with anything else for the role he's played in bringing this together. Dick is over at Creative Associates, and I know that many of you know him well. He's an old friend and colleague, and we've worked together on a lot of things. I'm particularly happy to be able to host this this presentation this morning, partly because of Dick's involvement, and you see an old friend like Ken Menthouse here to be with us, and meet some new friends from Interpeace. Interpeace is an organization I have a lot of respect for. I've worked with very closely in Burundi and Liberia, and even in East Timor, of all places, working with Georgina Yates and your staff, and some others. So I'm very, very happy to host Interpeace as well. But mostly it's because we're looking at the country of Somalia, that troubled land that is not getting the attention that it deserves here in this city amongst policymakers and others. I think the issues there are, it's obviously a brutal situation, a troubled situation, but also such a complicated situation. I think people are put off with even trying to deal with it to a certain extent. And so I'm very, very happy to bring some, to give the opportunity for some people who have been working closely on this issue to bring some light to it. I won't. I'm not an expert on Somalia, so I won't even begin to talk about it very much. But I just want to give one quick quote as a sort of scene setter to the rollout now of this report on the peace mapping study that Interpeace is going to be giving to us this morning. But it's actually quoting some remarks that Dick McCall made in December in Mombasa. When he said, "The international community's preoccupation with state building as the most pressing priority has undermined peace building, the foundation upon which effective state building can occur." That's happened in Somalia. It's happened elsewhere. And I know that we've been intimately involved in divided societies like Burundi, Democratic Republic of Congo, Liberia, and elsewhere. And we see this playing out, sort of looking at institution building and forgetting about the human factor, about the need to build peace, reconciliation, work with the players there who are the only ones in the end who could sustain peace and sustain recovery from that peace. So with those few remarks, let me turn it over to our presentation. We're going to proceed in, we hope, a disciplined and logical order, and I'm going to give that to you in advance. I'm not going to do lengthy bio presentations on our panel here, because you do have their full bios there that were on the table. I hope you picked them up. And we're going to proceed in the following order. Scott Weber is going to begin with some opening remarks. He's the Director General of Interpeace, and he oversees the strategic growth and development of the organization and provides support for their peace for the international field teams. He's going to give a brief introduction into Interpeace itself. Pat Johnson is going to follow. She's the Senior Program Officer for the Somalia Interpeace Program. She's going to give us a few words about the study, and she's also going to introduce a short video presentation that they're going to show us, showing their field work. Following Pat will be Jibril Ibrahim, who is the director for the Center for Research and Dialogue in Mogadishu, and a leading civil society figure in Somalia. He is going to talk about the links with the recent Mombasa conference of Somalia civil society. We actually had listed as a speaker Alexander Ramsbotham, but he can't be with us today. He's ill and will not be joining us. So Jibril will be followed by Mark Bradbury from the UK, who works on conflict resolution, Accord 21, Somalia issues. Mark is a social analyst who's worked extensively on Somalia and Somaliland, and has authored a number of publications on these issues, and we welcome his insights. And that's going to be concluded then by, we've got a conclusion team over there, a tag team of Abdirham Raghe, who is who is a permanent secretary, who was the permanent Secretary of Ministry of Interior until 1989. and has been working from Canada in the Somalia region in Nairobi since 1998. He's co-founder and the deputy director of the Somalia program for the WSP International, which is, of course, now Interpeace. And he's going to be joined in the concluding remarks, sort of wrapping it up for us before we go to questions and answers, by Ken Menkhaus, who most of you know is professor at Davidson College, a long recognized expert on the Horn of Africa, and has been involved in several programs here with us at the Woodrow Wilson Center. So we welcome Ken's return. So with no further ado, let me turn it over to Scott to begin the program.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you for hosting this event. We're all very pleased to be here. Thank you also to Dick for making this possible. Dick McCall played an instrumental role in the launching of Interpeace in its original form back in 1994 as a piloted initiative within the United Nations, when the UN was trying to understand how to help these societies that were falling apart from within to rebuild themselves and to be able to have a sustainable foundation of peace designed and owned by the people of that society, rather than to adopt solutions from the outside. And Interpeace has grown quite a bit since that time. We had piloted that initiative in 4 places originally, in Eritrea, Mozambique, Guatemala, and Puntland, Somalia. Since then, we have expanded this to, we're still in those, most of those countries, but we're also in Somaliland, it's the northwest of Somalia, and South Central Somalia, and you're going to hear much more about all of that today. We're in Rwanda and Burundi, in Liberia and Guinea-Bissau, in East Timor, as Steve mentioned, in Israel and Palestine, in North Cyprus and Southern Cyprus, in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and we're launching initiatives in Haiti, Sudan, and a few other places during the course of this year. A few things about Interpeace that are important in reflecting about the peace mapping study, which is a very important piece of work that our colleagues have carried out this past couple of years, is that for us, peace is only sustainable when it is really owned by the society and by the actors, the main actors in the country. And it is important to understand what they want and what their vision of peace is, not what ours might be from Washington or from capitals. And which is why Interpeace only works through local partners. We have no expats in the field. And our colleagues here, Jabril, the director of our partner organization CRD, based in Mogadishu, is an example of that. The peace mapping study is, we feel, a qualitative contribution to our understanding about Somalia, in that it is primarily done by Somalis. Understanding how Somalis sort out their problems. How do they come to nonviolent solutions to their differences? And we hope that those insights that the Somalis are expressing through this very intensive work can help us from the outside in the international community to have better approaches vis-a-vis Somalia and understand how to articulate our international interventions more effectively with the way Somalis can actually sort out their problems. And that's one of the reasons why we're very excited to have this opportunity to share this with people in Washington, so that we can better inform those efforts that might be trying to help Somalia in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So, as Scott said, the foundation of the peace mapping study actually came from an idea with in discussion with Mark Bradbury, who played a major role in the peace mapping study, along with Ken Menkhaus, who helped with the national level study. The rationale for the peace mapping study came out of the fact there's been several conflict analyses over different times of the Somali region and its dynamics. But we thought instead, let's look at how Somalis make peace, because that's much less studied. Mm-hmm. And that was the rationale for the study, and I think what makes it very interesting and exciting. It was a 3-year research process using Interpeace's participatory action research methodology, which therefore meant it involved over 400 people through interviews, focus group discussions, and so on, resulting in 5 volumes, actually, and then we don't have them all available here, but you can get all of them from our website. There's a volume each on Somaliland, Puntland, and South Central, and then on the national level, peace initiatives sponsored by the international community, and then the synthesis study, which summarises the other 4 volumes. There's also 5 films accompanying the study, and we're going to show you a short clip of a synthesis of some of those films. And the films are available in both English and Somali. So if you have a particular interest, then please do let us know. So through that research study, the colleagues, through the 3 partners that we work with in the Puntland Development Research Centre in Puntland, the Academy for Peace and Development in Somaliland, and the Centre for Research and Dialogue in South Central Somalia, represented today by Jibril, who's the director. They worked in their respective areas to document the different peace initiatives that have taken place since '91. And one of the things that comes out in the study is that below the radar, below the kind of what we more frequently hear about in terms of conflict and fighting and trouble, beneath that radar, there have been, for example, in South Central Somalia, over 90 local peace initiatives, most of which have succeeded in ending violence and restoring peace in their respective areas. And in many cases have also prepared the ground for the emergence of some kind of local governance structure. So that's, I think, some of the richness of this study, that it's bringing out a different dimension of the Somali context from that which is commonly known. I think also the studies, in particular, because there are 11 case studies which look in more depth at particular examples of local Somali-led peace initiatives, and including 3 of national level processes. But the 8 case studies of Somali-led peace initiatives are quite remarkable, give quite remarkable opportunity to look in detail at how Somalis make peace. And what one finds through that, which they're also a good read, by the way, so I do encourage you to look for them, but they're good. I mean, they tell a good story as well. But what comes out is the richness and complexity of Somali peacemaking. And that there's a lot there that we can learn from in terms of international engagement at different levels in the Somali context. There's a great contrast between the Somali-led peace processes and those that have been internationally sponsored at the national level. Some of the features of the Somali-led processes which are factors in their success are that there's very thorough preparation, and it's a process-oriented, incremental approach. Another key factor is respected leadership in the committees that oversee the management of a Somali-led process. There's a great emphasis on inclusivity in bringing in all different kinds of stakeholders, including the business sector, media, the women and the youth, both religious and traditional leaders, and so on. And also to ensure the inclusion of spoilers in those processes. It's a consensus-based approach, which means they take time, but it also means that when they reach a peace accord, there's buy-in and there's ownership, and that's what makes them more sustainable. They also address issues of substance. So although the primary and most pressing immediate objective of virtually any Somali-led reconciliation process is to end violence and restore public security in that particular area, they go on to address the issues between the communities in a thorough way. And the basis of the approach is restoration, in order that the communities can live together again. So the emphasis is on restitution and restorative justice rather than retribution. And that's through a collective responsibility and negotiated process of resolution. Often after the conclusion of a peace accord, there may be a specification in the accord that anyone violating the accord will be dealt with through Sharia law, which is, in other words, in terms of individual responsibility. And this is a more recent evolution of the traditional conflict resolution mechanisms. That's another thing that comes out very clearly in the studies, that although these the Somali-led processes are based on traditional conflict resolution, they're evolving and they're introducing new elements, including time frames for payment of compensation and so on. So there's a lot of innovations in this, as well as base of the traditional conflict resolution. So I can see that my time is nearly up, so I want to move to just introduce the film clip that we're going to show you. As I mentioned, there are 5 films that come out of that accompany the volumes of the peace mapping study, reflecting some of the work of the particular case studies that were focused on, and what we've, with the help of colleagues, what we've put together is a synthesis of clips from those 5 films, and we think that we wanted to take the opportunity to show that to you because I think it brings out some of the vividness of the processes and the ways in which people engaged.
We'll turn to our technical staff.
Thank you.
This is a very dangerous moment for them. They have no idea how badly I can mess this up. And then
Now click play film.
this one. Oh, play film. There we go.
Enlarge it to the whole screen.
I thought I had done. Is that it?
Go up top there. All the way there. Yeah.
Hargeisa, 1991. This is what's left after a decade-long civil war between the Somali National Movement, or SNM, and the Somali government forces. Hargeisa 2007, a rapidly growing capital city of close to 500,000 people, symbolic of the restored relations between communities affected by war.
I mean, it was mainly about forgiveness between the clans that have supported the government and those that have supported the SNM, and living and letting live. And I don't think we've had any problems to that regard since. Representation is important. And so the delegates that participate in peace processes must be people that truly represent the communities. People who they believe and have confidence in.
In Sanag, reconciliation meetings under well-shaded trees were common in the 2 years after the war finished in 1991. This is an area where major clans meet, geographically isolated from the capital Hargeisa. If long-standing grudges could be resolved here, it was felt they could be resolved anywhere.
The foundation of the peace in Sanag was the fact that for 2 years the communities came together in a series of meetings. The unique thing about this was that they met in twos at different venues. So each sub-clan was given the chance to deal with the little problems they had with the other in these separate meetings.
Women have made significant contributions to Somaliland's peace and nation-building processes.
At the height of the conflict in Sanag, one of the most important responsibilities taken up by the women of this region was bringing messages of peace from one side of the conflict to the other. This was especially helpful in getting the pastoralists to peacefully share resources like grazing and water. Women who were married into a clan different from their own were particularly effective in carrying messages of peace from their in-laws to their own clan, and also from their own clan to their in-laws.
First of all, women are most of all peace lovers because they stand to benefit least from conflict and war. Women don't have a clan. They are born into one clan but get married into another. So when it's her family clan and her in-laws fighting, it's so difficult for her because on the one hand, it's her brothers that are dying, and on the other hand, it's her husband that's dying. So naturally, women work for peace and making sure conflict doesn't easily break out. This role includes mobilizing resources and funding and preparing the venue.
There was one great opportunity without which I think nothing would have been possible for Somaliland. This was the fact that we intentionally refused to allow any armed groups or individuals to participate in the Boroma Conference. This was because if armed groups attended the conference meetings alongside the elders, nothing would have gone right. If Somalis are left alone, they will resolve their differences. If Somalis are able to avoid the interference of others, they will solve their problems. And we have seen this. Somaliland is a good example.
In Somalia, there are traditional ways of living that coexist. The majority, though, depend on nomadic pastoralism and farming in the rural areas. Despite being the economic backbone of the country, this sector is still underdeveloped. Livestock rearing and farming are seasonal and depend on the movement of human and animal populations in search of food, pasture and water. Access to such resources often causes conflict, and violation against vulnerable groups provokes instability.
When two clans share the same rural area, if conflict occurs, the disputes are most often over settlement, grazing lands or water sources.
Somali communities have their own customary and traditional law and methods of conflict resolution, which operate whether there is a state authority or not.
When a clash between two clans is reported, the titled heads from neighboring clans come together and urge the warring sides to stop fighting. The titled elders then say, "We are the elders from your neighboring clans and cannot ignore your hostility. Stop this fighting and submit your dispute to us." These senior elders summon the elders from the opposing sides to a formal mediation process. After hearing the case, the mediators impose an in-kind penalty on the guilty party, usually animals or money. The titled elders also settle on compensation as redress for the pain suffered by the victims' families and to pay for the funeral expenses. Once the victims' families have received redress, negotiations start on blood compensation and other measures to prevent conflict again in the future.
We came here at the request of the Siad brothers to agree to take over responsibility for this youth militia. We're brothers, war-torn brothers, and I can see there is still tension.
You don't know the effects of the conflict. It has had its disadvantages. One of the most gruesome experiences among the people of the two communities was in my case, when my son's uncles, who were from the Sad and the Salaman respectively, killed one another. I got two calls from the two sides at the same time, consoling me for the death of my people, my brother and my brother-in-law. It is not wise for such a man to fear war, nor it is something to dream of.
One of the biggest challenges was how to convey the results of the conferences and workshops across the huge geographical area that had been the scene of fighting between the clans. It was essential that the peacemakers brought people together on all fronts, from the Ethiopian border to the Indian Ocean coast. This is the peace caravan in the Hobyo area, the only way to disseminate the reconciliation to the nomadic people in the remote countryside. Some of these men had not seen each other for years, brothers divided by war, now reunited in peace.
turoba intaad colahaadii iskaga tagtaan tubta nabdeed balla raaca xumaan tirtira dadkeenna ka tuura tanfaararaqi xumaa tanasul sameeya arrima la kala tirsado tamartu walid haddii aan laysku tiirsanayn tusmeeya inaad wanaagol isugu tagtaan.
In November 2007, 2 reconciliation meetings took place in Khore, under Butinle district, to resolve a prolonged conflict between Omar Mahmoud and Barhasame subclans. All attempts to resolve this conflict had failed in the past. The conflict initially started as a result of disputes over the construction of water reservoirs.
Conflict is built on fear. As long as the two communities fear each other in searching for pasture, sharing water, or taking weapons with ammunition, when moving from one place to the other, there is no peace.
Successive meetings took place in the towns of Garowe, Galkayo, Lassanod, and particularly in Butinle district in May, where the two sides were reconciled. There also agreements were made and signed regarding the demolition of some 8 water reservoirs that Omar Mahmoud subclan had constructed in Adada and Ariska settlements.
In favor of the community sustaining the greater damage, the judgment was to destroy the other side's reservoirs, which had been fully intact.
We bulldozed and leveled to the ground huge reservoirs, some with water and some without. That was the biggest challenge, because to the owner it meant losing his wealth from in front of his eyes, whereas for his opponent this was the only solution to the problem.
I accept the decisions made by the elders, the committee, and the Puntland government. I surrender my reservoir as the first to be demolished in return for peace.
This meeting was unique in that people were willing to give up their water reservoirs and their part of the settlement in return for peace. It is a level of concession I have never before witnessed in Puntland.
470 heads of camel have been exchanged here today. A date has been fixed for the remaining part. This is the path to peace and reunion, reconciling the once divided communities. This is a historic day for everyone and for our communities. Today we cherish peacetime and brotherhood. We have found the key to peace and came closer to one another. We have always been and we will continue to be neighbors. It is very important that we exchange camels and reconcile today.
A lot
of effort was made by the elders, the government and the community at large. The goal was to resolve the conflict and ensure that the problem never comes back again.
This conflict was based on settlement disputes. It involved neighbors closely related by blood. Besides God, it was the neighboring communities who intervened in the conflict to prevent it from expanding.
Soomaalidu waxa ku mahmaahdaa
qofkii soo joogsan laga waayo soo jifsa laga helaa
marka ceelaliyo heshiiso ayaa reer maar cabaa
sow godobi surikaad martaba sabab qarsoon ma sow namadi sahaydaada ood sidato umma
nabad haddaad haysato wax kaa maqani maba jiraanba.
Thank you very much, Pat. Bill?
Thank you very much. My presentation is quick, linking Mombasa conference we held recently. But I would like, in reference to this, I would like to just say, recently I came across an article entitled "Somalia: Optimism Graveyard," and I was a bit upset when I read it because it doesn't really take into account of what is happening on the ground. Life goes on, people are trying to move forward, and the peace mapping we're presenting today is really indication of what is happening inside Somalia. Despite all the negativity, the conflict and killings you see on the media, I think communities are moving forward. But how do you make sure that local processes have a link with the national? And that is probably Ken and my colleague Ragi will answer those questions. One of the issues that has been the existing Somalia for the last 20 years, one of the key actors that has played and kept Somalia as it is what it is today is a civil society actors. They have been providing services both in terms of social service sector, education, health, media, and everything going Somalia along the line with the traditional elders we just saw on how they resolve local conflict. And for the last year and a half, civil society Somalia came under heavy attack from various groups, including mainly radical elements. Number of them were assassinated. Some of them left the country and moved outside Somalia in attempt to reduce their role in rebuilding Somalia. Last December, Center for Research and Dialogue and Interpeace has organized a conference held in Mombasa in which we invited 180 Somalis across the globe, not only Somalia. 3 generations came together. Those who are old generations who participated the previous conflict, the middle generation, those of us who don't know where to go, and the last generation is those who born in the diaspora, who happen to have a Somali identity but not linked with the Somali itself. And that meeting has generated quite a deal of optimism and also produced a document that I will share with you in a minute. The group also consisted of 3 groups: Somali Diaspora, from Auckland, New Zealand, all the way Minneapolis came, Somali business community who own business across Africa and beyond also came, as well as in Somalia, and then civil society who came, small towns, regions in Somalia. So it was really a good opportunity to reconnect civil society across Somalia and allow them to reopen the political space that seemed to be closing up in the light of the onslaught from various groups on the civil society. The meeting was aired or streamed live through the internet for the first time. Somalis across diaspora were watching the programs through live in the internet, so they could see what was deliberated. At times we have 25,000 Somalis watching the program or the event live in the internet, and that also has generated not only the room of 180 people, but also thousands, maybe millions of Somalis had opportunity to observe what was happening. The issues that we cover in that meeting ranges from economic to social and political, and the outcome was 2 documents. One was a document we call communique that basically articulating the vision or the views of the people who gather, and those who also attended via satellite. But also another document came up called Mombasa Declaration of Principle of Peace, and this was a very strong statement, civil society saying that along with what the local people are doing, but also Somali civil society are deeply committed. In the meeting, given the prominence and importance of the meeting, a number of presidents has called in. The president of Ismail Umar Gel of Djibouti has requested to speak to the delegates. He did. The president of Somalia, transitional federal government, Sheikh Sharif Sheikh Ahmad, also spoke. The president of the Puntland, and later on, President Museveni of Uganda has also sent his support. It was an event that they felt this is, if Somalia has to recover, these individuals, groups should be given a role to play. Also, the political opposition groups inside Somalia, all the radical elements or those in the middle, none of them came forward and criticized because the implication was huge. You have such enormous influence in the room, they could not really challenge them. They may have they said that we have a problem of some element outcome that came out, but in principle, they agree overall outcome of the process. So one of the themes that came out, Mombasa Declaration, was a 12 principle that more or less synergize with the peace mapping outcome. As a matter of fact, the two are not separate. When the peace process, this mapping has been happening a number of years, but this meeting only takes place for one day, and in a very strange way, they actually come up exactly the same conclusion, which is a very strong statement that Somali civil society and local peace building. Some of the element that came up was the issue of public fund management issues, how to deal with it. International community and its role. I think copy of this is outside, so anyone who can pick it up. It talks about the sanctity of Somali culture, what to be done in issue of terror, particularly those who use terror to achieve political mileage out of this. So those are the processes that come up, and I think I don't want to go into details, but I think this Mombasa Declaration and the peace mapping, as well as my colleague Mark Bradbury in a minute will talk about, all of them indicates that I think there is a new culture now developing inside Somalia, where local communities are now saying for the first time we would like to move forward. We can no longer wait, particularly in South Central Somalia, where people have been saying that we've been waiting 20 years. Now there is a serious commitment from local level, but how do you really engage and support local processes so that they have some impact in national level? I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Jabril. Mark, perfect lead-in.
Thank you very much, Jabril. As Pat said, I was involved in the Interpeace peace mapping study, but I'm here today representing an organisation called Conciliation Resources, which is a British organisation that does peace building in various parts of the world. One of the things it does is publish an issue called Accord, which is a series of studies of peace processes in different countries around the world. And the latest issue is on Somalia. This has been very much a collaborative project between Conciliation Resources and Interpeace, and it builds on and extends the peace mapping study that Interpeace has been doing. The issue has over 30 articles in it, interviews with Somali elders, with international diplomats, academics, civic activists in Somalia, and I think brings across some of the complexities of the Somali crisis and different approaches and perspectives on it. Somalia is entering its third decade of civil conflict, and a third decade of protracted humanitarian crisis, which we should not forget, and 2 decades of foreign diplomatic and military and state-building interventions have failed so far to stabilise the country or to date to establish a government that has any broad legitimacy within the country. There's been very little time spent on distilling some of the lessons from the past 2 decades, and what we wanted to do with the Accord publication and the policy brief that accompanies it is not to produce sort of prescriptive recommendations, but to try and draw out some lessons that can perhaps help shape future actions in Somalia. And I'll just touch on some of the broad sort of conclusions that come out of it. One is that over the past 20 years, the nature of the crisis has changed from a civil war in the late 1980s through to a clan-based warfare and predatory warlordism in the early 90s, a regional proxy war in the 1990s, to what we have today, which seems to be a sort of religious or ideologically influenced war, which has global dimensions. And this changing nature of the crisis has been very problematic for both Somalis and for internationals trying to resolve it and build peace there, because it raises questions about what it is that one is engaging with and what needs to be resolved, and what appeared to happen to offer solutions yesterday may no longer be relevant today. And at the same time, there are a number of continuities that run through the conflict, continuing elite and clan-based power struggle over resources, the regional proxy war, and a continuing crisis over the nature of the state. The international community's engagement in Somalia has also changed from the sort of large, massive unison peacekeeping operation in the early 90s to what in the last decade has been an intervention very much informed by the global war on terror. And there are and have been consequences to the way in which the international community engages there. And one of the things that we highlight in the Accord issue is that the international community needs to think carefully about the basic assumptions that have guided its strategy in Somalia. And one of the aspects of that is that international engagement has very much largely been based on international security concerns, whether they are to do with issues of migration or disease or arms or terrorism or jihadism or piracy, rather than the security concerns of Somalis themselves. Another conclusion, and this is the sort of crux, I guess, of the Interpeace peace mapping study and the Accord issue, is that despite all these headlines of piracy and warlordism and jihadism that have become, Somalia has become associated with, this is not an ungoverned land. It's not a place where development has stood still, because in the past 20 years Somalis have rebuilt their towns and their schools and their medical facilities, their universities. There are many more universities now in Somalia than there ever were before, and there are multi-million-dollar businesses that Somalis have developed there. This has largely been through their own resources and their own efforts. So while there have been multiple international diplomatic and military forms of intervention there to try and resolve the crisis, Somalis themselves have over the past 2 decades developed systems of governance to manage conflict and provide security and law and order. And this is something that's very much highlighted in the peace mapping study, and which we bring to the fore again in the Accord publication. There's a very telling statistic that Pat mentioned that comes out of the peace mapping study, and that is that the partners of Interpeace have catalogued over 130 Somali-led peace processes. This is not the sum total of all peace processes, local peace processes. But it's an indication of the level to which Somalis have been engaged in trying to manage their own security. Not all of these peace processes have succeeded, that's clear, but many of them have achieved considerable success in mitigating and ending violence, or as in the case of Puntland and Somaliland, in establishing governments that enjoy a high degree of legitimacy. Many of these processes that the Interpeace peace mapping study talks about have been led by clan elders, as we saw in the film, drawing on rich institutions and mechanisms for managing conflict. But there are also other social actors have been involved, such as women engaged in searching innovative ways to deal with security problems, such as disarming the militia. And again, these issues are picked up again in the Accord. So there are questions as to why these local processes have had some success while the international ones have been problematic, and can anything be learned from them? And the articles in the Accord issue and the Interpeace peace mapping study point to a few of those. Identify several of them, and I'll just point to a few of them. And the first one was, as Scott mentioned at the beginning, I think, is this issue of Somali ownership. And this is an extremely important aspect of the local processes. They are locally designed. They're locally mediated, they're locally managed, and they're locally financed, which contrasts very much to the international peace processes. These are events where inclusivity, as Pat mentioned, consensus decision-making are important characteristics. Accountability is an important characteristics of them. Reconciliation is central to successful peace processes, and it underlines the point, I think, that reconciliation is a prerequisite for establishing government, that the governments in Puntland and Somaliland exist because because peace has been established rather than the other way round. Another lesson that these local processes bring, or that come out from these local processes, is that security governance is not something that the international processes have managed very well. In fact, in many ways they've got wrong. Ceasefire agreements internationally tend to be negotiated as an addition to a peace accord, as an addendum to a peace accord, rather than negotiated as part of the peace process. And this contrasts very much with Somali processes, where security arrangements are negotiated as part of that local peace process and involve measures for de-escalating violence, for building confidence through interim security arrangements, for joint security, through joint security mechanisms, for managing demobilization, managing militia, for establishing freedom of movement between areas, for establishing rights of return and residence for people, all things which have largely been missing from international peace processes. And ultimately, these Somali-led peace processes are very much about governance and establishing governance institutions, and in their simplest form, they involve restoring social contracts between communities based on traditional customary law. But as I said, in some cases they also involve creating much more complex arrangements or governance arrangements, such as Somaliland and Puntland. I could go on, but I think my time has probably run out. So I will pass on to Rage and Ken.
I will pass the floor to Ken to conclude the summary of what we heard. But before we do that, anyway, I will say when I came to New York this time, and I went through the fortress anyway of going through the check, anyway, electronic checkpoint is, and really, I mean, that it was very difficult anyway to easily go. I remember immediately what happened after the collapse, before the collapse, when I joined the United Nations anyway, as a national officer, and I got the opportunity to come to the headquarters, and then I showed my ID and I walked through easily. That concern of now going through and giving ourselves to the electronic checks and all that is a need for peace. Anyway, a peace not only in Somalia and in the local processes, what we heard now, but the whole world anyway needs. People like us, not the young children and those who are growing now, who know nothing about exactly, I mean, what peace means and what happened in this world. But people like us who are old, when we see exactly how really beautiful the world was and how it is today, we value exactly, I mean, that peace is matters for all of us anyway. And below the screen is of violence and killing and all that, and the versions of civil war of Somalia. And every day what you see, the struggle of the Somali people anyway, and others really in the world and in Africa, to really regain their sense and to really, I mean, go out of conflict is a everyday struggle. I think what we have learned from these peace processes has got a lot to do with not only on the national level of Somalia, but beyond, anyway, on the regional level and international level. The Somali crisis and the Somali really, I mean, case is not now for Somalia only. It has been regionalized, it has been internationalized, and it really haunts all of us. I think I stopped there for to wait exactly. I mean the questions, and then pass the floor to Ken.
Thanks, Jorge. For those of us who've worked on Somalia for a long time, one of the things that's most difficult to reconcile are these two dramatically different images of Somalia. On the one hand, this country that has been a site of complete state collapse for 20 years, protracted armed conflict, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, production of 1 million refugees. I mean, a basket case in the vernacular. But at the same time, for those of us who've had the privilege of working in country and at the local level, the vibrancy, the adaptability of local communities in coping with this very difficult set of cards they've been dealt, their ability to build and rebuild both peace and local governance and extraordinary economic networks. These two images really clash, and part of the challenge here is, for me, I've been asked to try to bring them together and ask the so what questions. So we've documented this extraordinary vibrancy in terms of national reconciliation. What does this mean for the bigger picture? And I'd like to just focus on 3 dimensions of that. First, what can be learned, what kind of lessons can be learned from the local level peace building in Somalia that might help inform national reconciliation, enrich it, and most importantly, improve its prospects for success, because that's by far and away the most dramatic finding here is this, the hundreds of, well, or at least 130, the many local peace processes that, despite very non-permissive conditions, have endured, and then the very poor record at the national level. Well, my colleagues have already alluded to a bunch of these lessons learned. I'd just like to focus on a few. The first was the very first comment we heard, Dick's observation in Mombasa, that at the local level, reconciliation comes first, and then discussions of governance at the local level comes second, whereas in our national reconciliation processes, we have substituted state building for reconciliation. We have essentially reduced reconciliation to often a very crude cake-cutting exercise about which group gets which ministry, with all of the underlying conflict issues going unresolved. And I'll give you a very, very concrete example, and one that puzzles a lot of outsiders. The word federalism, which many outsiders, when they look at Somalia, they say, well, the transitional federal government, of course federalism is the solution. It will de-emphasize the conflict over the central government. It already is a model that appears to be working in varying degrees in Somaliland and Puntland, so what's wrong with federalism? Why do so many Somalis, when they hear that, break out in hives? Well, the reason is because they've never been given the opportunity to resolve critical conflict issues over rights and identity in Somalia. What does it mean to have a federal system if you haven't yet decided whether that will be an ethno-federal system in which some Somalis will have rights to live and vote and establish businesses there, and others won't? We really can't talk about federalism there until those kinds of fundamental issues of identity, land, and citizenship in Somalia are resolved. A second lesson learned, and again one that's been alluded to already, but I'd like to reinforce, is the idea of human security. The reason that these accords stick at the local level is that they address directly issues of community security. At the national level, human security has tended to be overlooked in terms of security for the state. There is a big difference between the two. In theory, state security forces ought to be providing security for the community. But when you build police forces with the idea that and other security forces with the idea that their principal role is to protect the government and expand its power, and when those police forces then become one of the main sources of insecurity for the local community, they become predatory, obviously you're going to have very little local support for those security sectors. And so that focus on human security, I think, is really an important reason why so many local peace processes have succeeded. And then one just to build on Mark's point about accountability at the local level. If you recall from the film, the peace talks involved a circle of elders, an inner circle of elders, but there were a lot of people around. You can hang around at the edge, the periphery of these peace talks, and you not just hang around. Somalis feel free to chime in, but more importantly, one of the things that I found so remarkable in the few times I've had an opportunity to watch these peace processes at work at the local level is at the end of the day. When the elders have negotiated and talked and disputed, they don't just go home. They go back to their local communities and they stay up most of the night telling them about the proceedings, getting their buy-in, their input. And what struck me as a political scientist was that in contrast to our normal models of negotiation in which you've got a ratifier and a super ratifier in the background who's usually a leader, the people were the super ratifiers. These things don't stick unless the people have heard about them, they've had their input, and the elders go back. There was that very direct, immediate vetting of the negotiations at the local level that has so often gone missing at the national level. And I think that's something that is really important if we're going to have national reconciliation work. And I think we are behind the ball in terms of the potential for new technology to help transform that problem. You may or may not know, but Somalis have been at the forefront of the use of communication technology, new communication technology in Africa, the use of the cell phone and others. We can fix this. And in fact, one of the peace processes, and ARTA did actually have televised proceedings so that people back home could at least watch and hear what was going on. A second implication is, so what does this mean for state building? And this is for many policymakers in the U.S. government and the UN. This is the big question because state building has, in fact, come first. The transitional federal government is a state that was built without adequate reconciliation, but it's what we've got and it's what we're working with as a result. There's actually to my mind, 4 different answers to this question about does this local level peace building have anything to say about broader state building? And the first answer is no. This is of no particular importance to the grand exercise of state building. It's ephemeral. Second is yes, this does impact state building, but it impacts it in a negative way. This is a threat to state building. These are alternative sources of authority, sometimes producing not only peace, but then alternative sources of governance that are beyond the control of the weak, nascent government, and the government sees it very much as a threat. And that has, in fact, happened over the years in Somalia. Governments have watched these local processes with fear and suspicion. And that's too bad. It does not have to be that way. But it can be perceived that way. A third interpretation is that this is of real importance to state building, at least as a temporary, as a transitional measure. And here what we're talking about is when a state, like the transitional federal government, is willing but not able to project its authority into the hinterlands of the country, that it views these non-state actors that are building the peace and sometimes spinning off local governance in the process as a partner that they negotiate with, again, at least as a temporary measure because they're unable to do it themselves. This mediated relationship is already happening in places like Somalia. It's happening in many other countries. We could go comparative here and talk about everywhere from Sudan to Afghanistan and Kenya. But this is a potential answer to the question, what does this have to do with state building? And then the fourth answer is, yes, this kind of vibrant grassroots peace building and governance building is important, not just as a temporary bridge for a state that's willing but not able to govern directly, but it could actually be the genesis for a more organic formation of a Somali state on its own terms, as opposed to the template that we tend to plunk down on states, presuming every single state has to have the same structures that that we have. And I think historians are going to judge us very harshly in 100 years. Why did it occur to you that every single nation in the world had to have the same district council, regional council, ministry of this, ministry of that, as though there was only one model of state. Well, maybe the Somalis have other ideas. They might be messy, fluid states. They might not be states remade in our own likeness, but they might work more appropriately in Somalia. I would say these kinds of questions about the relationship between local peace building and state building are essentially up to the Somali people. They'll decide which is the appropriate answer. And then the final question, so what does this mean for international policy? What can we do if, in fact, we've now got this rich documentation of local peace processes? Can we help? And here there's a number of quick answers. First is respect the do no harm principle. These are fragile local processes. External actors that don't have adequate contextual knowledge or throw too many resources at it can easily undermine them. We can also undermine them simply by not paying attention to the fact that they exist. And this happens all the time. We've seen a lot of state-building exercises in particular essentially inadvertently bulldoze local informal arrangements simply because we didn't know. Where assistance is warranted, and I think it is, it needs to be surgical, and we have successful cases of this. Very careful USAID assistance to Somali communities in northern Kenya over the past decade that were replicating the same kind of peace building there. They needed a few important inputs, not too much, and AID through contractors were actually very successful in providing that and not disrupting it. What the other things that we can do, though, is to promote political space for these kinds of processes to succeed. And here, Jabril's discussion about civil society is very sobering. What we're facing right now is Somalia at its hour of greatest need for continued sustained peace building at a time when the most important set of actors, this rich panoply of civil society groups, elders, business people, professionals, and others, are under enormous threat and duress. Many have had to flee the country. Others have been assassinated. Still others have chosen to remain silent because of fear that they've never had before. In the past, civil society in Somalia has been able to negotiate the dangers because they were relatively predictable, and they were quite good, expert at risk management. But one of the things that's really heartbreaking is to hear them say now, we're in real danger, and the worst part is I don't even know what direction the bullet is going to come from. It's unpredictable danger now from all sides, and so Somalia has been robbed of key actors at the time when it most needs it. And then, as an addendum to that, I would say one group that we certainly can and must reach out to is the diaspora. The diaspora, both the far diaspora living in New Zealand and Canada, and the near diaspora, the large Somali communities now living in places like Nairobi, Kenya, are terribly important in all this. In fact, so much so that some Somalis in country say this whole war is really a war of the diaspora. They're leading both the government and the opposition, and we're caught in the middle. Well, to the extent that we can reach out to the diaspora and provide the support that diaspora members of goodwill need, I think that would certainly help.
Thank you, Ken, for that very provocative wrap-up. Let me first of all congratulate the panel for this unprecedented and amazing adherence to our time frame. You've done a remarkable job and covered an awful lot of ground. Let's hope that you will be as disciplined in your questions. Please make them questions, not statements. Keep them to one question a person, not a series of questions. Remember, we're being webcast, so we're going to send a microphone around. When I recognize you, we'll do about 2 or 3 questions at a time to pose to any member of the panel or to the whole panel or anyone who wants to respond. Identify yourself when you get the microphone for the sake of the webcast. So we'll open it to the floor. I see one right here, and I see 2 in the back. We'll get 2.
My name is David Shen at George Washington University. By way of preface, I would just like to say that I fully support the concept of supporting local peace building. I think there's a lot to be said for it. I think the international community ought to be more supportive of it. My question may suggest that I have some concerns about it. It's not intended to be that way at all. But no one has mentioned the impact of al-Shabab on local peace-building efforts. There's been some allusion to Islamic extremist activity, but I'm wondering what has been the impact of the rise of al-Shabab on the ability of these local peacemaking efforts, and are they continuing to proceed with as much success as they had in earlier times before Shabab was so well ensconced in the country?
Thank you, David. I saw one hand right at the back.
Hello, Lawrence Freeman from Executive Intelligence Review magazine. I think my question is sort of a follow-on to Ambassador Shin's question. I was wondering if Ken Menkhaus or others could tell us where we stand right now. In other words, the transitional government has held on. There is this split among the guerrilla groups. I don't know how the United States and others are intervening. Where is the condition for the country, for the transitional government? How fragile is it so that these processes could be properly evaluated, what the impact will be? Sort of an update on the political geometry of Somalia would be useful.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. Yes, and one right there beside you, Mamadou. Thank you.
Thanks today. My name is Brian Stout with USAID. I actually wanted to follow up on Ken's last point about diaspora engagement. One of the things we're looking at is particularly domestic constituencies here in the United States. And if you have any specific recommendations for strategies for constructive engagement, whether it should be focused on economic empowerment or whether it should be focused on civil society strengthening here that can then translate into civil society strengthening in Somalia. Thanks.
Okay. Let's take those questions. You were mentioned prominently there, Ken, so let's start with you. And
Actually, I thought Jabril would be in the best position to answer that impact of Shabab on local peace process, because he's already talked about that a couple times this week.
I think the local peace processes are taking place despite all the presence of radical elements in the country. As a matter of fact, some areas of the country where processes are taking place are the areas that Shabab are not there. For example, in central region of Somalia, where elders are now for the first time learning or pushing the agenda of setting up local peace process. There is pockets in southern part of the country where Shabab were unable to infiltrate because community has set up such a structure to sustain itself. So there is, of course, the challenge will be there. In the case of Mogadishu, for example, where most of these processes might have benefited more than other part of the country, the elders are fled. As a matter of fact, most of them are in Nairobi. Some of them have been assassinated. Others have been put pressure, and therefore they could not have done any work. But some part of the country, the local processes are preventing others to have a root in it because it's a community-oriented, community-based. In the Baye Bokol region, for example, despite all of various group presence, still clan elders are commanding authority, and you cannot do nothing against these people because the structure. So it's depending what part of the country are we talking about. Some areas are still trying to grasp the idea of not being able to deal local dynamic as they see fit because element of radical element present in their midst. Other areas they've been successful, and there is a tendency right now throughout the southern part of the country where people are now for the first time saying that the only way to defeat radicalism is to set up local peace processes because it creates community cohesion, it allows community to move forward, and this goes back to the issue of transitional federal government as well to take advantage of these political openings in the country. You can only have peace process can be successful. I think one of the lessons learned from the peace process is that you can have a local peace process, but local peace has to sustain itself, and to sustain you have a local authority. You have some institution to support it and maintain it. Otherwise, you will not be able to have a peace process because violator will be there. Still, you have to deal what we call firefighting, putting out. But you have to have a system that link up local processes, as Ken talked about. Very quickly, can I take some answers about the issue of diaspora?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
I think there is a realization diaspora as a part of civil society. Everything that's happening right now in Somalia, both negative and positive, by the way, are credited to the diaspora. I think we have the cabinet of transitional federal government when they sit meeting, they're NATO plus Australia meeting more or less because everybody has a different passport. and you will be surprised how impact they have. Sometimes you might not have the best candidate from the diaspora. Having American passport doesn't mean that you're qualified to run the country, to be honest with you, and that's the problem we have. But so the impact of diaspora is there, but also there is a serious problem right now because it, December 3rd, for example, one British, one American was assassinated, happened to be Somali ministers, and the guy who assassinated happened to be from diaspora. So it's really very sad in the sense that how we're receiving, both sides coming in, and what is strategy to deal with it. I think it has to be a comprehensive approach. It's not a piecemealing of diaspora engagement. I think the diaspora, for example, there is a project that diaspora local schools, hospitals have been built, but they cannot sustain it, and there is no international community coming along. So there has to be a strategy where the resource put into the Somalia by the diaspora should be matched by the international community rather than disassociating the two. So there will be wasted of time and resources. You might build a school, but there is no one to maintain that school. There might be a hospital. So diaspora are coming in short term, not providing a long term impact. But also public education as well. I think diaspora can have impact on local level. For example, media has been very effective. The Somali diaspora are all using media the highest level. Local radios now are, most of them, to be effective radio, you have to have a satellite connection. So people from Australia, Europe, more or less, are now listening and watching what is happening inside Somalia. And the diaspora have much to do it. So it has to be a comprehensive strategy. It's not only one-time shot. We have now programs now being proposed by the USAID and others, which is good. But what I see this program is that it's not incremental. It has to be a really systematic approach where things are building up upon to that level.
Thank you. Rage, do you want to comment on the diaspora?
I think the diaspora. I think many things have changed now in the relations of the diaspora and the engagement of diaspora. What have changed is the real, war of ideas now. Previously what we knew is that, a telephone call coming from Somalia to a diaspora, member or center or group or what was very effective. And the reality of asking questions why and how and what do you mean, and it was little. I think that has changed completely. And this is really one of the promising stories that we have now, that the diaspora is asking themselves that hard question. This came as a really true trial and error, because now their children are not safe, their mothers and fathers behind, are not safe, and now it comes to exactly, more than exactly what was clan and really power sharing and power struggle and all that. It's an ideological war. Therefore, hard questions are coming. As organizations working on this dialogue and peace building and all that, this really, gives us a lot of really, encouragement, and promotion that we see now. It is coming to the brain. It is coming to the here to ask hard questions. And I think this is one of the strategies that among the comprehensive strategy in Jibril was proposing, that we have to know now there are a lot of really open lines that the people inside Somalia and the diaspora could talk and exactly, the shared experience of what is happening now in this ideological war are really bringing the Somalis, whether diaspora or here or anywhere, together. What we see is exactly, last night we met with a group of diaspora, myself and Jibril, and we were very much encouraged, really, the way they really, saw the situation, more than ever what we saw before.
Thank you. Okay, Ken, Mark, would you like to talk to the overview, the update?
Actually, Lawrence, on your request for an update, we had entertained the possibility of starting off our talk with that, so that for the benefit of people who haven't been following Somalia closely, and then decided against it because we didn't want this to devolve into a sit-rep kind of panel. So plus, I think there are as many sit-reps on Somalia as there are people in the room, and I wouldn't dare to do that just now. In terms of the question of the impact of Shabab on local peace, I think there is, as Jabril was saying, plenty of evidence that Shabab is not in a position to directly confront local authorities. In fact, is not making an effort. One of the things that's interesting about Shabab is that it has not made an effort to govern, really, in the territories that it controls militarily. It has intelligence, it has informants around. It controls in terms of security, and it provides, in most cases, better public security than people had in the past. But they haven't yet taken that step to create their own local governance. In the few places where they have, it's been a pretty horrible experience, and they backed off. They also haven't, interestingly enough, declared a state, which they could certainly do given the amount of territory that they claim to control in southern Somalia and much of the capital. And they're apparently divided as to whether or not that's even a project that they're interested in. But all that to say is that a lot of local politics, local reconciliation is going on, and they seem to be fine with that. The key for me in that relationship is this: where we have had, we've got a lot of different situations locally in Somalia. There are the happy stories that we've shared, where communities that have been fighting have come to broker a peace. We've got a lot of other parts of Somalia where they haven't been able to broker a peace, and there's been chronic instability, places like Kismayo. There are also places that are peaceful, but they're peaceful because there's a victor's peace, because one clan or group has come in and imposed itself and its strength on others, and this is important, and I hope that local Somali communities are coming to understand the consequences of that, because where the victor's peace has been imposed, where you have aggrieved weaker groups, that's precisely where Shabab is recruiting. They have intentionally recruited aggrieved local communities, minority groups, low caste groups. Now whether those groups have any particular long-term interest in the ideology and the worldview that Shabab espouses, or whether they just see Shabab as the only group that might be able to redress their wrongs, I don't know. But to me, that's a message to local communities that the victor's peace is no longer an option. You better make sure that your local peace is inclusive and accounts for everyone's needs. As for the diaspora question, I'm a bit torn on this. The diaspora does a lot of amazing things when it comes to development and reconstruction. When it comes to the state and state building, this is just my personal view, I think one of the problems that we face is that this large Somali diaspora is not, in fact, doing what we presume it's doing, which is to say, especially in the West, living in and learning about normal politics and governance and democracy and civil liberties and absorbing that, and now they can be vessels to bring back these good ideas to Somalia. It ought to be happening, but the fact is a lot of Somali diasporas, and particularly those in North America, don't see themselves as full citizens of the United States, of Canada, of elsewhere. Some of them, a certain percentage, are here on false pretenses. Maybe they didn't tell the right story for immigration. Maybe they're here illegally. They've come across from Mexico or elsewhere. They are still seeing the state as a threat and not as a source of law and order and governance. They are evading the state, they fear it, and we're missing a golden opportunity as a result for them to, in fact, learn normal politics and the fact that the state can be an enabler of development and can be a source of protection. So part of me wants to say what we really need is a fairly sustained civics program for the Somali community, to bring them in, to make them understand what it means, both in terms of rights and responsibilities of being a full citizen of the United States or Canada or Great Britain, so that they don't see themselves, in fact, the way that this seems to replicate itself everywhere. We've been talking about Nairobi, Kenya, and Eastleigh becoming a state within a state. How can we bring Somalis into that sense of having full citizenship in the states that they've made their new home, even if they eventually do want to go home?
Okay, anyone else on any of those questions? Okay, I think we have time only for one more round of questions. We'll take some more from the floor. 3. Let's see, a hand at the back first, and then Mamadou right here.
My name is Sarah Cobb. I'm faculty at George Mason University, and I'm would like to explore a little further the notion of reconciliation that was underneath the peace processes that were mapped. Nadler et al. Have got a really nice book out that differentiates socio-emotional reconciliation from instrumental reconciliation. From afar, it looks like the Somali peace processes are deeply, they have a lot of kinship with traditional negotiation processes, which would imply that they're slightly more instrumental than socio-emotional. And, you know, I have no way of knowing from the outside. I'm just curious. So I was wondering whether or not you all could speak to that, to the nature of the reconciliation that is promoted. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, Bob, right here. Yeah.
Thank you. Bob Berg, Alliance for Peace Building. I was wondering whether the international community, African and non-African, should, in your view, act differently in regard to successful peace building, particularly Somaliland and Puntland. Does the absence of official engagement become a disincentive for peace, or is it helping the peace in the rest of the country?
Okay. Thank you, Bob. And right at the back, member of the diaspora.
A member of my diaspora. My name is Hussein Ali Yusuf. I am a student at George Mason University. I would like to follow up with what Sarah said, but say this. It is obvious that these peace mapping that you have done is really working at the local level, and it's an amazing thing. But I think it is nationally, it is very obvious that the bonds of the Somali people are broken. They are really, really, really broken. And that is very much pronounced here within diaspora. I'm very interested to see what, if Interpeace is interested in promoting something within the diaspora here. A similar initiative that you've done. Because here you have about, in the diaspora we have 400,000 people who have been displaced, and now they're reclaiming their country. And unfortunately, they are fragmented. They are more fragmented than the people who are fighting at home. And sometimes they kind of left each other. So how do you really... it will be very interesting, I think, if you could comment, if you will be interested in doing something with the diaspora.
Thank you. Well, probably that first and third question can be handled, Pat, Jabril, Scott, about the process. And
I was going to hand it to Mark.
Okay. As you will.
Thank you very much.
Little rugby here. And Scott?
I'm not personally not entirely clear about the distinction you were making in terms of reconciliation, but I mean, I would say that certainly what the kind of mapping or the kind of conversations that were had during the mapping and the research was drawing out was that these were very much instrumental reconciliation processes. About opening up, restoring relations between communities as a way of opening up trade routes, for example, or allowing people to resettle in areas which they had been displaced from, establishing institutions of governance. I think removing the gun from the street. I think so. I would have said there's very much sort of instrumental forms of reconciliation. The question about Somaliland and Puntland. I think one of I think the Secretary General's representative in Somalia recently came out and said Somalia is moving from a collapsed state to a fragile state, which seems to me slightly premature. But I guess it's always been strange in the way that the international community has not responded a bit more proactively to areas such as Puntland and Somaliland, which are in many ways fragile states with systems of governance there that one could use the development frameworks that international agencies have been talking about for years now, about ways of supporting fragile states. That seems to me that some of those frameworks could be applied more proactively to Somaliland and Puntland.
Can I just add something on the question about? I fully agree with what Mark said about the nature of the processes being instrumental, but I don't think it's an either-or. And I think that the Mudug-Galgadud reconciliation processes, which is one of the case studies, and there was a clip of it in the film of people reuniting. There was a very interesting stage in that process, that reconciliation process, which in fact CRD and supported with the help of one of our other partners, PDRC, where the first, in the initial community conversations before that reconciliation process really got going, the community said that the biggest problem was going to be the militia, particularly because it was spread over such a large area. So that actually the first practical step in the process was bringing together militia leaders for a workshop or a kind of process together. I mean, one could talk about it at length, but even bringing the militia leaders, both sides together, was extremely powerful in itself. I mean, this guy's killed this guy's brother and so on. For them to sit in the same room together was already a phenomenal kind of achievement. And then they went through a process of sensitization and talking about conflict resolution and anger management and different things. And it was a very powerful experience for those militia leaders. And as the community elders emphasised afterwards as well, and some of those, some of those militia leaders became the biggest proponents of peace after that, and because they were had been embedded in the conflict and knew exactly what had happened, where the money had come from, and whatever for funding the conflict, they were in a very powerful position to challenge and be constructive in supporting the peace process. So that's to say that I don't think. I mean, although I think. I absolutely agree with Mark that the initial at the outset, the reconciliation may be about stopping the fighting here. It's interrupting trade. It's there's a lot of death. It's become too expensive for anyone to kind of continue to support. But there are all sorts of other dimensions, and the social emotional is certainly one of them.
Scott, anything on the process were you going to?
Yeah, I just wanted to say a more general point regarding diaspora work, which Interpeace does do in many contexts, including Rwanda with a very vibrant and divided diaspora as well, and in other contexts. And I wanted to just reflect on the fact that given the level of connectedness through IT tools and mechanisms, particularly in the case of the Somali diaspora, which is more than probably any other diaspora that we've seen, or possibly as connected as, say, the Sri Lankan diaspora or some others, the diaspora for Somalia are implicated in everything that's going on in Somalia. Things that happen on the ground are known globally in the Somali community in minutes. And so, and there's an ability to comment on what's going on, to influence, to connect to the reality on the ground. So that means that the diaspora groups are not a separate group that one needs to try to address as a group. In fact, it's not a group. It's a myriad of different identities, of groups, of individuals who have connectedness to the context on the ground, which makes them a very important sector to engage with, but they cannot be analyzed as a group. Two is that often what we see with diasporas is that it's almost as though their watches broke the moment they left the country, and that time stands still for them, and that they are stuck in the reality of when they left and the circumstances of their departure and their resettlement. And I think there is a lot of work that can be done to build understanding with that diaspora of what is really going on, what are the positive elements, and how can they contribute. And I think that's the last point I'll say, is that You said, can Interpeace engage with the diaspora and help? Well, they are. Their colleagues are, in fact, going to Minneapolis in a couple days, I think, to engage with one of the largest communities of Somalis in the U.S., precisely to engage in such dialogues. But I would encourage people from the diaspora not to wait for groups like Interpeace or CRD or APD and our other partners to engage in such fora. Take the initiative. Start your own processes, from basing it as these documents indicate on Somali culture, on the ways of solving problems, but do it yourselves, and then share those lessons and those messages back. And there have been great examples of that already in the Somali diaspora. But take the initiative yourselves and start a group, start a process here in the Washington area.
Yes.
I think two really, quick comments. One is Somaliland and Puntland. I think when Somaliland and Puntland play a really very good demonstrative effect for this growing really regional trends and regional really. Anyway, we know exactly Somaliland and what now this stand is for. But exactly this is a question that comes into the engagement of whether the diaspora or the Somali community, that's issue-based dialogue that will come. I think this we see exactly the time for that, and whether engaging the diaspora or the rest of the community, anyway, especially the community that is land, I think this is the stage or the level where issue-based engagement is really, taking really off. What I mean by that are there are certain issues that are relevant to the Somali really recovery now, like exactly the decentralization, anyway, regional processes that are going on, the issue of federalism, the issue of Somaliland, which exactly the Somalis should finally decide on that anyway through the process. There are others of the human security and others that are emerging as issues. I think the new phase of engagement of the diaspora should move to that issue-based engagement rather than exactly, the sensational news and day-to-day, and using them as a cash cow for both development and the destruction, anyway, of Somalia. I think if I just really, leave that, the other point I would have really reported is exactly, engaging, the diaspora. We are trying really, to, along those issues, anyway, to really, engage with them and try to see if we can build with them, anyway, the necessary network that is issue-based. Anyway, the Mombasa conference have started that, and we see a lot of prospects that things are moving into this war of ideas, into this really, challenges of issue-based challenges.
Just very quick to follow up. Recently, there was a town in North America where a Somali man happened to be recruited to become a police officer. And a week later, chief of the police received some Somali member, Somali community, saying that you have to also hire our clan. So the police chief said that, you know what, this guy is a cop for everybody. It's not for sub clan. And I think what that tells you, by the way, is just what you just described, Hussein, which is this level of broken relationship with the Somali diaspora. It's very serious. I think for us, frustration you have. I just came from Melbourne, Australia, and and I met Somali community political leaders. They really want to engage Somalis, but Somalis are fragmented, because the same thing in UK. Somali community are at the bottom of the ladder in terms of community engagement. So how do you really make sure that these communities are engaged? And I think I agree with Scott that local community need to do something about it, but also sometimes you might need from outside element whom they can trust to broke that relationship and develop that. I think it's happening in different way, but also it depends region to region. Where you have a Somali community, for example, in suburban Toronto might do well, or in Ottawa, compared to the Somali community in Melbourne, Australia, who have just recently arrived, hasn't got it, someone that doesn't speak the language, and the implication of the complexity they're facing, and the package they have is there. But those who live in Washington district area might be, as Scott indicated, that 20 years back, when they left 25 years ago, still might be, a weird Darod kind of dialogue. That might be things frozen there, and still the reference is that aspect. But Somalia has moved forward. So how do you? It's a question of reaching and dealing with different sectors and different areas of diaspora groups. But certainly, Somali diaspora need to be engaged in a very positive and incremental way that are helpful among themselves, but also can help the host countries that they live in it. Otherwise, that power is divided. Somali community cannot get benefit back home. The host countries are having frustration with them. So I certainly agree it has to be some engagement. I don't know, can I just 2 points added, if you don't mind?
No.
One has to do the issue of humanitarian. I just take up opportunity. The humanitarian crisis is getting really bad in Somalia, and I think I would like to bring your attention, even though this is not a part of the peace mapping, but I thought conclusion, I think it's very, as you know, WFP has suspended its operation in Somalia with a serious consequence, by the way. Come to January, May, June, July, when the drought area begins, I think there will be serious implications. Therefore, I think it has to be a way, USAID and others, and U.S. government to really come up with new strategy to deliver the food, because people are desperate need. You know, who benefits carrying the food has to be known. It's not only the radical element, but also Somalis on the ground who, depending on these food handouts, would be suffer greatly. So therefore, it has to be a way. It has to come away. I'm just warning that the worst is to come unless something is done. Issue of the TFG, someone indicated, I think TFG is making progress. I think if you compare the first 9 months, it was horrible. I think they have not done, they're traveling, flying here and there, very much frustrated, those of us inside the country. But I think for the last 2 months, there's a substantial shift has taken place. I think they stay inside, they have done some changes, things are moving from that direction. And I think now is a time where we really have to support them if they're doing something very positive. And there is now a political space. There is a realization time is running out from the part of the TFG, and there is commitment from Somalis inside and outside that the TFG is the only option, alternative we have now on the table, and the TFG is now learning the lesson in a hard way. They're losing credibility, but now, starting from September, October, November, I think they have done a great job in terms of moving forward a national agenda, changing it, bringing new people on the political landscape, and I think international community, particularly U.S. government, need to really come forward in a comprehensive support, with of course stick and carrot as well. Thank you.
Okay. The second question on the international response, reaction to the local peace building, and maybe lessons learned for the international community from the local peace building. Ken or anyone on that?
I don't have anything really more to add than what's already been said. Thanks.
Okay. Well, we're doing very well on time, so I think we can take one more round of questions. Yes, right in front here. Mamadou. Wait a moment.
Thank you for the panel. Ken, I have a question to ask you about how do you propose...
Identify yourself, please.
Oh, my name is Ibrahim Mohammed. I am one of the local Somali diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
I've lived in Washington area more than half of my life. You've proposed that the Somali diaspora should become reintegrated with the community they live in with. Let's talk about the Somali community here in U.S. We suddenly have become the Trojan horse in the war on terror. How do you propose we pass that and become civil with the government and society that we believe thinks we are the terrorism or the terrorists? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Question right across the way there.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. My name is Samhara Raya. I'm with Oxfam International. Two questions linked to civil society and diaspora supporting peace building. By way of background, I grew up in Minneapolis. I'm a member of a Eritrean diaspora, but I also have seen the evolution of Somali diaspora and the role that they play and the role that many diaspora play. I'm very reluctant about anyone forming assumptions, especially in capitals like this, that the diaspora are the key to unlock a peace process. I participated in Darfuri and Sudanese diaspora peace-building efforts, and it was remarkable the distance between the diaspora and the local sentiment. So my question, I think Jibril's points about the Mombasa conference and civil society being representative of all these different aspects is what I'd like to hear more about in terms of what we should focus on in Washington and whether it's at AID or in the NGOs or state. It's about engaging with the Somali civil society, which we hear very very little from because of the communication or the threat. I would argue that there's a need for diaspora and civil society in Somalia to connect more directly. But for those of us that are not a part of the diaspora, I think there's a serious lack of knowledge about the efforts being done on the ground, and this is why CRD's work and Interpeace's work is so helpful. How can we support efforts such as the Mombasa conference and opportunities for civil society to have a voice against the threats of al-Shabab or the threats of state interests and so on?
Thank you very much. And Mamadou, right across over here.
Good morning. Thank you very much. My name is Naoki Ishikawa from the United Nations Department of Peacekeeping Operation in New York. I have a question from a little bit different angle. I understand that there has been some studies about the past UN engagement in these peace processes, and then my question is that is there any lessons learned with regard to the role of the United Nations in this process? Especially, Dr. Menkel's mentioned that now we need to provide the very careful support for these local processes. What is the role of the UN presence on the ground right now, like United Nations Political Office in Somalia, which locates in Nairobi? How can we support these local initiatives through our system? That's my question. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, maybe, Mamadou, we'll take one more right at the back there.
My name is Mahmoud Noor. I'm a retiree of the World Bank agriculture from Somalia, originally. The conflict now, the main conflict is between Shabab and the transitional federal government. Both of them claim that they will apply Sharia law in Somalia. And there was at least one attempt I know of where religious leaders, prominent Somali religious leaders, also international religious leaders, try to reconcile using Islamic principles of reconciliation. What happened to that? I mean, how, if they both claim Sharia, why can't they reconcile based on Islamic reconciliation methods, which are not much different than the traditional Somali reconciliation methodology?
Okay, thank you very much. Let's. The first two questions still related to the diaspora question, so maybe Jibril and you can begin on that. And I think one was directed right at you, Ken.
And I absolutely agree with you on the issue of diaspora. Diaspora has been left out. A number of Somali reconciliation conferences, diaspora has not been active, where some of them are extremely active in the art of peace process. Diaspora is invited to participate. But Leila, as I indicated in my early intervention, that diaspora has not been engaged, has not been appreciated, the work they're doing it. Even though, as I indicated as well, that diaspora, in the context of regional development, they become a target. And sometimes very hard to know whom you're targeting you. So it's absolutely critical. I think what we have done in Mombasa meeting was to create that political space, to create that connection and appreciation. And for the first time, because of that meeting, as I told you earlier, the number of countries in the region, as well as institutions, local Somalia, are now realizing the need to engage diaspora. As a matter of fact, there is a saying in the context of recent Somalia that whoever's diaspora supports wins. As a matter of fact, Islamic Sharia court, when they come to power, diaspora was the one that make them what they are. I mean, civil society play a role in terms of engaging them, supporting them, legitimizing it, so to speak. And one was expecting transitional federal government, when they arrive, they will connect and use diaspora to make sure that they further the peace. But that hasn't really happened, even though the president and most of the cabinet are from the diaspora. For somehow there is a gap there. I hope they will re-engage. But this meeting we have done, I think, we would like to take a one more step, that we now shed light that diaspora is the Somali civil society, including diaspora, a very crucial actor in the development and rebuilding Somalia. That we're now planning to have further develop and create a network out of this in which Somali diaspora outside and those inside will be connected, whether that will be project oriented, whether that will be a dialogue between the two groups. We had just a meeting in Nairobi last week where Afghanistan civil society came to Nairobi, and we had a dialogue of can we learn from you? What is the prognosis of your problem? What are the lessons can we offer you? What lessons they offer us? And I think it comes the same thing. I think there is evolution where in the radical element, when they come to power or capture an area, the first target will be those who are educated. And that happened the same thing in Afghanistan, where Afghanistan share with us that majority of civil society left into Pakistan, other part of neighboring countries. The same thing is happening to us. And only they came back when the international community also realized that you need to engage these actors to play a role, and now they came back. I think the same thing happening to us with that evolution. But we create the platform. Our intention is to also educate the international community that diaspora, Somali civil society has a role to play. Their skills and resources should be tapped into it and should be encouraged. And mechanism in which we engage is a totally different. Some countries, for example, now, March 5th, the European Commission is inviting in Brussels Somali civil society for consultation meeting. USAID now is also realizing that engaging civil society is very important. In Nairobi level as well as in inside Somalia, there is now momentum. And I think that is why we wanted to share with you that civil society are now ready. I think there are people dying on the ground. People have been, every single institution in Somalia where there's a director or staff are killed, someone else come and plays it. No institution has been closed because of someone was assassinated. And that tells you the tenacity, the commitment they have to push forward the peace process. But sometimes what you don't have international partners that give you the kind of support you needed. And classic example is that 555 Somali civil society was assassinated last year, and no one came up. 2 people were killed in Nairobi, the whole world cries. I mean, is the value of Somali civil society is less, or that of Kenyans are better, or perhaps Kenyans are more organized in that sense. So therefore, it's absolutely critical, and that's what we try to convey, that Somali civil society, absolutely, if you want to push peace process, and civil society include, by the way, elders, international elders, to push peace process, you absolutely have to have a role for civil society, and they have to have a partner, not only a Somali partner. And what makes civil society global work, that relationship they have outside world. It's not only inside, but sometimes you have that relationship has been cut off. And on the other side, we also blame ourselves because some of us left in Nairobi, and of course with a good reason, and have some division ourselves. But I think now there is a realization civil society has a play to play, and policymakers, we beg them, and we ask them, we encourage them to engage and seek civil society input and participation of any development that takes place in South Somalia is very crucial.
I think part of Samar's question was, how can the diaspora contribute to the process? I mean, like the Mombasa conference and other things, get engaged in the process.
And I think that's what we have done. I think this is the same thing we have done in Mombasa can be done and duplicated. That's what I'm trying to say. That we actually invite Somali diaspora to a meeting in Mombasa, which has huge implication and outcome was exactly what we expected. But you want this continuous sustaining engagement, and therefore consultation is very important. For example, the Swedish government, last 2 years, they have been doing a good job where a national strategy towards Somalia are shared with the Somali diaspora. We'll call in the ministry, they sit down, and at least that's what Somali diaspora was telling me sometimes. It's the same thing Norwegians are now, what they're doing right now also, they're inviting, I was told that when donors come for money for Somali diaspora, I'll call in to sit on the table and say, what do you think? These guys are asking us $50 million. And I think this is a good empowerment and engagement. And that might be kind of Somali diaspora can play a role in terms of contributing a real concrete way into the peace processes. But the countries outside need to really use and seize that opportunity.
Okay, thank you. Ken, you by turn, and also pick up on the UN question as well.
I will do that. Thanks. Ibrahim asks a very important question because the context of particularly in the United States for Somali Americans is the global war on terror. Over the past 2 years, the increased focus on the Somali American community, thanks to the 24 or so diaspora members who went back, joined al-Shabab, a couple of whom have blown themselves up as suicide bombers. Somali Americans are now one of the top preoccupations of U.S. law enforcement, and I know that because suddenly my phone started ringing about a year and a half ago from U.S. law enforcement agencies who know nothing about and never had to need to know anything about Somalia or Somali Americans, and are suddenly scrambling to figure it out. And I would say in the process of them suddenly applying a full court press on the Somali American community, who are you, what are you doing, are there terrorists in your midst, a community that was already predisposed to view the state with suspicion because it has had a long and very unhappy experience with states, both in Somalia and then as refugees in Kenya. The state is something to be avoided and evaded or placated with burnt offerings to make it go away, but not to be engaged. And so this has just created a state of siege, I think, within the Somali American community, which is very fearful. And my advice to U.S. law enforcement agencies has been, you have to fully engage this community. You have to routinize your engagement with this community. You have to win their trust over. You have to make them understand the difference between rule of law, which is what we like to think we have in this country, and rule by law, which is what has happened in Somalis elsewhere, where the law is a tool to be used by predatory governments at their expense. And so again, this notion of a civics program at the grand scale to win Somali Americans over, both so they understand their rights and their responsibilities, is something the U.S. law enforcement has to do. It must do. As for the Somalis, the Somali community, most Somali Americans are actually doing quite fine. I think we have to say that we're talking about a subsection of the community that is not. But my simple advice would be, we've got to find a way to get out. Get out into the community. It breaks my heart when I hear Somali friends tell me that they have family members living in Columbus who don't know a single American who isn't a Somali American. They live in their own world. Now, it's fine to have your own enclaves. We have Little Italies and Chinatowns, and everyone has that. There's nothing wrong with that, but that can coexist with also getting to know the community that you're a part of, whether it's through sports or other things. But we've got to find a way that Somalis feel that they're actual citizens. And just to reassure you on one thing, the feedback that I have heard from law enforcement, when they ask me for, can you help explain this community, because we don't understand why they're doing this or this or this. For instance, we don't understand why there was a double murder in Minneapolis, and one of the Somali elders came to us and said, "Don't worry about it, it's settled. We've taken care of it." And the police are going, "Oh my God, you killed the murderer? You took care of it? What are you talking about?" They panicked. What do you mean you took care of it? It was a double murder. And I have to explain, dia and blood payment and a compensatory rather than a punitive form of justice, collective responsibility for this rather than individual guilt, which suddenly they have this huge epiphany. But again, to reassure you, 99% of what they end up asking me about isn't terrorism. They all seem to say the same thing. We know there's been a handful. We have to look into it because it would be catastrophic if a Somali American came back as a sleeper and blew himself up in a mall. But what we're really concerned about is the gangs and the other kinds of all the other law enforcement problems that Somalis seem to be beset with. They really are interested in trying to help. I mean, the vast majority of them, they don't know a whole lot, but they appreciate the problems and just can't figure out a way to engage. No, and I've heard that there are some real heavy-handed people who come in to intimidate and whatever, and that's something they have to address as well. As for the UN political office question, this is a question that's bedeviled the UN. I worked in UNISOM in the political affairs section back many years ago. Same problem we had then we have now, which is to say, at the local level, it's very difficult to engage unless you have deep contextual knowledge. We don't have people in the field who have that. The UN political office and UNDP, in terms of providing assistance to building governance, tends to focus exclusively now at the state level. And here, my simple advice would be: don't see the state as the end in and of itself. See it as a means to an end. I think the tendency has been to be very template-driven and to view your success in terms of, number of civil servants trained, number of police, trained and armed, as opposed to the real metric, which is, are those new police making the community safer? That should be the metric. And I think too often they tend to confuse means and ends with the state. When they do engage at the local level, there have been successes, sometimes working through groups like Interpeace and others who do know the lay of the land well, to try to provide support to district councils and others. But there have been other cases where the UN has come in and very clumsily supported a district council without realizing that there was this whole other system of informal governance that's now been disrupted, and in fact even in some cases armed conflict breaking out.
Yeah, I think going back to the UN, the Somali peace process and state building processes and even the humanitarian processes went through transitions anyway, and finally it became permanent transition. That you are going again the same thing anyway, permanent transition anyway, that never lasts but comes again anyway and again to the same point. I think at this age what we see now is that permanent transition is really having some review anyway on the Somali side and on the international side, and especially the UN, which is one of the main lifelines of the for the Somali people of the aid industry anyway, is very important anyway to change anyway with this new changing dynamics and changing really. And anyway, we are very happy when we went to New York this time that we saw anyway the different departments are really responding to this and talking about integration of the programs and talking exactly, understanding the context, which is very difficult anyway for the UN, anyway, some of the UN anyway organizations and or departments anyway to really, leave the project really, based really, delivery to a process oriented anyway, something that incrementally build this into something anyway, not exactly, peace meaning having a small project today, and when it goes wrong, really, shutting it off and starting a new one. Anyway, we have seen that was really, very much, anyway, very useful anyway, but especially on the humanitarian side, anyway, but at the same time, it's not really coming into an incremental, really, value. We are very, really grateful for the departments of the UN that they are looking into that.
Okay. Well, we also still have one question, and you can comment on that certainly. But I want someone to take up the question on the link between the TFG and Shabab and why is Islamic principles working in terms of bringing them together.
Well, to the one of the UN, there was someone I met in Mogadishu recently, and he was telling me that I cannot wait until UN comes back. And I said to him, why? I want to become rich. No? As simple as that, Well, he was saying that last time last time Amazon or UNISOM came was one or two Somalis with I don't know, $100,000. They left it, a couple of them millionaires, so to speak. So, and I think that really tells you the story of sometimes the expectation, not only the money aspect, but also warlordism as well. That people want to really get more guns, more resources. So I think it's very critical that the UN really look in the event that peacekeeping coming up. There is lessons to learn from Somalia. Our colleagues in Afghanistan were telling us they were 22 years old in Afghanistan who now has $112 million, and he started a translator. Eventually end up 1 or 2 million. So it's a very serious. In terms of resource, sometimes it's misused and misappropriated and whatever, and it really creates a lot of loopholes. But the case in Somalia, where local tradition is functioning, local things are moving along well, and then the UN comes with a bunch of money, and that really destroys the whole dynamics and creates new dynamics. And therefore, I think there is a lesson, at least from Somali side, has been documented. You can read it, but there is a lesson to learn from Somalia in the sense what has happened. On the issue of religious, I think, yes, in February, in March, as a matter of fact, it was February when the president has said that I will implement upon coming back from Djibouti that they will implement Islamic Sharia court, Islamic Sharia, and also appointed a committee of 9 elders, traditional elders, but traditional Islamists as well as religious groups. Some of them come from Qatar, who are international solidarity, Islamic solidarity organizations, and the effort the government publicly made that they will implement Islamic Sharia according as they see fit. On the other hand, at the time, the month of March, April, and May, there was really silent in Mogadishu, where a government has said that we're Islamic government, we implement Islamic Sharia. B, AMISON will leave 4 months as the religious group is presented at the time, and the government was saying that we will be open to bring others into the fold of government. But these 3 months, nothing has happened. I think that's the best 3 months we had for a long time, because there was no gunfire here in Mogadishu. You could not, how can you really against of this? How can you say, I don't like foreigners, they will leave? Well, Islamic Sharia, we're implementing it. I want to be part of the government, please come on in. All these were good in terms of the only argument made by the time of the opposition groups was that the government has given away Somali Sea when the agreement was signed between Somalia and Kenya, or memorandum of understanding. But what happened though was that some of the elements, particularly the religious groups, some of them was threatened, so they have to leave the country. Those who propose amalgamation or creating one single Sharia, because their view was that you're not talking about clear Islamic Sharia. A government who had been conceived wrongly in Djibouti cannot implement it. The government members are not even Muslims, let alone to implement Islam, according to some of the radical groups. So they have a version. So what you have right now is that the government has not come up forward a mechanism in which Islamic, other than saying we implement it, but nothing has happened on the ground. But on the other side, they implementing their own version of Islamic Sharia, basically abusing Islam as such in different ways, cutting and killings and so on continues in the name of Islam. So we have a really serious right now crisis where again there's discussion going on right now where Muslim leaders, Islamic leaders within Somalia, either in Saudi Arabia or Qatar or other part of Somalia, are now for the first time thinking about issuing a fatwa. In other words, saying that this is not acceptable what is happening. They have done it, but Islam becomes a victim of a political maneuvering between groups, not really Islam as such. So therefore, you have a government saying that we are right. On the other side, you have opposition groups saying that you cannot even talk about Islam because you're not even Islam, so to speak, to begin with, because you've been conceived by outsiders. So it purely becomes a political agenda of both sides. But that is why now you need a traditional or Islamic scholars within Somalia, respected scholars, to come forward and propose and make a statement or create a fatwa, as many argue, saying that this is what we think is right. Last time they did it, but they didn't go all the way down. They just simply said that we believe what the government doing it, and we also ask AMISON to leave in 4 months' time. All this happened, but even those who said that become a victim, none of them is inside Somalia. They have to leave because they side with the government, so to speak, at the time.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I reluctantly will have to bring this to a close. We're at the end of our time. I must say on a personal level that I've had to be very disciplined myself because, as many of you know in this room, the Woodrow Wilson Center, myself and my former colleague Howard Wolpe have been very involved in conflict transformation, peace building, trust building, collaborative capacity building programs in Burundi for the last 8 years, Liberia, DRC more recently. And a lot of the principles we've been talking about here with Interpeace are ones that we adhere to and use in our work. So I resonate very strongly with the kind of work that Interpeace is doing and congratulate you for it. Welcome. I want you to join me in thanking this sterling panel and help yourselves to the literature that's outside. Thank you very much.